When most people think about money, they imagine that every dollar behaves the same, that $10,000 is simply 10 times more than 1,000, and that the difference between financial positions is mostly about scale. But in reality, money begins to behave differently once certain thresholds are crossed, and one of the most quietly powerful of those thresholds sits around $10,000. This amount is not large enough to create wealth, yet it is often large enough to change the relationship a person has with financial pressure, risk, and decision-making, and that shift alters the way money moves through a person's life. To understand why, imagine two individuals facing the same unexpected expense. The first has only a few $100s available, while the second has around $10,000 sitting in reserve. The expense itself may be identical, but the psychological and financial consequences unfold in very different ways. For the person with only a small cushion, the event triggers urgency, forcing immediate adjustments, delayed bills, or new debt. The individual with a larger buffer still feels the cost, but the system around their finances remains stable, and stability changes behavior in subtle but powerful ways. This is where financial psychology begins to interact with basic mathematics. Small financial reserves create fragile systems. When a system is fragile, even minor disruptions require reactive decisions. Those decisions often carry secondary costs, such as interest, penalties, rushed purchases, or missed opportunities. Over time, these small reactions accumulate, not because the individual lacks discipline, but because the structure of the system forces short-term solutions. Once the reserve approaches $10,000, a different pattern often begins to emerge. This amount rarely solves every financial challenge, but it begins to absorb shocks. Instead of every disruption forcing immediate correction, some events can simply pass through the system without triggering cascading consequences. The person is still budgeting, still planning, still working within limits, yet the environment around their decisions becomes calmer and more predictable. From a mathematical perspective, this creates a threshold effect. Below a certain level of reserves, expenses and emergencies frequently generate compounding costs. Above that level, many of those costs disappear because the system can handle interruptions without restructuring itself. The difference is not dramatic in appearance, yet the cumulative effect over years can be significant. Historical financial studies often observe similar thresholds across different economic systems. Households that maintain even modest reserves tend to experience fewer forced financial decisions, fewer high-cost borrowing events, and fewer situations where timing works against them. The reserve does not create prosperity on its own, but it changes the timing of financial choices, and timing is one of the most underestimated variables in personal finance. Another shift occurs in the way risk is perceived. When reserves are extremely small, most decisions are filtered through immediate survival. People become naturally cautious about opportunities that require temporary discomfort or delayed rewards. This is not irrational behavior. It is a logical response to fragile conditions. But once a financial buffer exists, the brain begins to process options differently because the cost of being wrong becomes less catastrophic. In this sense, the $10,000 threshold functions less like wealth and more like structural stability. It reduces the frequency of crisis-based decisions and increases the proportion of deliberate decisions. Over long periods of time, this subtle shift in decision quality can influence saving patterns, career choices, investment behavior, and even stress levels connected to money. What makes this threshold particularly interesting is that it rarely receives attention in traditional financial conversations. Discussions often jump from budgeting advice directly to investing strategies, skipping the middle stage where financial systems become stable enough to support long-term planning. Yet for many people, this middle stage is where the most meaningful psychological transition occurs. Reaching that level does not eliminate financial uncertainty, and it certainly does not guarantee any particular outcome, but it alters the structure of the environment in which financial decisions are made. Instead of constantly reacting to disruptions, the individual begins to operate from a position where some disruptions can simply be absorbed, Over time, this changes identity as much as it changes math. Money is no longer something that arrives and disappears within the same cycle. It begins to exist as a layer of protection around daily life. That layer does not need to be enormous to change behavior. It only needs to be thick enough to prevent every small event from becoming a financial emergency. And that is why, in many financial systems, the shift around $10,000 is less about the amount itself and more about the moment when money stops behaving like a constant crisis response tool and starts behaving like a stabilizing force within a person's economic life. Like and subscribe. Goodbye for now.